Pan-Africanism? Is it an exclusive club? What does it mean, and what are its origins? Do women have a voice in Pan-Africanism, or are they relegated to domestic duties and supporting roles? Where does Pan-Africanism sit with the current Black Lives Matter movement, and is there any correlation? Is Pan-Africanism inclusive of all people of African descent, no matter gender, sexual orientation, class, or race? What can be considered Pan-African fiction? Where are women in Pan-African fiction as authors and characters?
Hi, Mjiba.
Hi, how are you?
I'm fine. We'll just give it a few minutes and let's see people come online and then we can make a start.
Sounds good to me. Sounds good.
How is it in Ghana right now? What's the weather like?
The weather is odd. It's like the rainy season. So it's raining, but it's a little hot, and so it's just you're not really sure what's happening when you wake up in the morning.
Yeah, pretty much the same here in Trinidad, actually, except that we're getting lots of the Sahara dust coming over as well. That's fun.
Okay, nice.
Okay. Now, I don't know how to tell when people are online, but as we only have an hour. Okay, so technical support says wait a few minutes. Okay.
Okay, sounds good. He'll give us directions.
Yeah.
And welcome everyone.
Yeah.
And
we're starting in 2 minutes.
Okay.
So we can carry on talking about the weather. That's what us British do.
This technical support guy is very serious, I'm telling you.
Yeah, no messing there.
At all. So,
okay, so this is exciting.
Yeah.
I've watched quite a few of the Pandemicus events, and it's nice to see some different faces.
I agree. And also, I think it's good to have like two women who are talking about, Pan-Africanism from two different continents. So it's great. I'm excited.
Yeah. Okay, so we are going to make a start. So I'd like to welcome everybody to this session of Pandemicus. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being with us. And as you know, we're going to talk about Pan-Africanism, women, and fiction. And I'm here with Mjiba Frehiwot, who's in Ghana, and I'm Muli Amaye, and I'm here in Trinidad. So I just thought that we would start with perhaps having Mjiba give us a rundown. I know she has a PowerPoint talking about Pan-Africanism.
Okay, excellent. So let me
start talking. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I think there's some interference, but no, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I was just saying that we're going to start with you talking to us about Pan-Africanism, because I know that's your speciality. And then we'll kind of just have a chat and we'll talk about fiction and we'll talk about women. I'll obviously talk about my novel. And then we'll just see where it goes. We'll hopefully get some comments. So yeah, I'm Muli Amaye. I coordinate the MFA in Creative Writing at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad. And you are?
Mjiba Frehiwot, and I'm a research fellow at the Institute of African Studies here at the University of Ghana.
Okay, so we'll make a start. So Mjiba, would you like to take us through Pan-Africanism?
I will, and I'm going to share the screen because I have like a little PowerPoint. I promise only to talk for about 10 minutes. I tend to be long-winded, so I'm going to put myself on a timer. And so let me share the screen real quick so that I can get us to what I want to do. Let's see if it'll work. Yes, and let me share. And I'm going to go directly to the PowerPoint on Pan-Africanism. Can you all see this?
Yes.
Excellent. So I'm just going to walk us through this for about 10 minutes, and only because I feel like, you know, many of us are very familiar with Pan-Africanism, but some people in the room perhaps may be unfamiliar. And so I wanted to walk us kind of through what Pan-Africanism is, talk a little bit about maybe a few critical women, and then also ask us, like, where do we go from here? So I like to always tell you what I'm gonna do. I hope to present just some working definitions of Pan-Africanism, maybe look a little bit at Pan-Africanism and gender. I'm gonna talk about two key Pan-African women, or one Pan-African woman, and then some key Pan-African organizations very briefly. And then I'm just going to highlight some current manifestations of Pan-Africanism, and then ask you, where do we go from here? So what is Pan-Africanism? And I'm going to stop for 3 seconds because I want to put my clock on. Because if I don't, I will begin to talk for the rest of the time period. And that's just not correct. that would not be balanced at all. Excellent. So Professor Horace Campbell, who was recently our Kwame Nkrumah chair, defines Pan-Africanism as a body of thought and action shared but not uniform or dogmatic. A dynamic movement continually transforming itself and gaining new ideological perspectives in light of changing circumstances. He says it enriches itself through its own experience, rowing from masses, groups, occasionally leaders of governments, tending to the goal of restoration of freedom and dignity for Africans at home and abroad. And I like to bring this definition because he talks about a body of thought and action. It's shared but not uniform or dogmatic, right? And it's like dynamic, it's always moving. So when we think about Pan-Africanism, we recognize that the Pan-African movement and Pan-Africanism has have ebbs and flows, different actors, different women, different men who have really tried to transform Africa and African people globally. And then Kwame Ture, and this is not necessarily Kwame Ture's definition, but this is a definition that came out of the Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare by Kwame Nkrumah. But Kwame Ture says that Pan-Africanism is the total liberation and unification of Africa and African people under scientific socialism. So Ture is saying, Africa must be liberated, totally unified, and then there must be a scientific socialist economic system in which Africa operates under. This is in 1995. And then Kwame Natambu in 1988 suggests that Pan-African nationalism is a nationalistic unified struggle, resistance of African peoples against all forms of foreign aggression and invasion, in the fight for nationhood and nation building. The primary goal of Pan-African nationalism is the total liberation and unification of all African peoples under African communalism. And I brought these two definitions because they both talk about the total liberation and unification of Africa and African people, I would contend. And then also this question of an alternate economic system, right? Some people say that Ubuntu is appropriate economic system or ideology for Pan-Africanism, but this ultimately is suggesting that capitalism as an economic system is not the correct economic system for the African continent. So now, why are we talking about Pan-Africanism in relationship to gender? First off, I would contend that women have been in the forefront of the Pan-African movement from its inception. From prior to the 1900 Pan-African Conference, women have been in the forefront of the liberation of Africa and African people, right? From Yaa Asantewaa to Nani of the Maroons to Harriet Tubman to everyone in between, right? Women have ultimately led the charge for the Pan-African movement. Unfortunately, history tells us, or who writes history ultimately dictates who are the stars of the Pan-African movement. And unfortunately, that happens to be men generally. But what is gender? And why do we think that Pan-Africanism and gender has something to talk about, or there's some disconnect? We know gender is socially constructed and it's reinforced by society. And the reason that women are left out of Pan-African history is because of patriarchy, which is a system of society or government in which men hold the power and women are largely excluded. Patriarchy is clearly a product of capitalism, and it impacts all aspects of life, including our family, our community leadership, national leadership, and even Pan-African leadership, which is why when we talk about Shirley Graham Du Bois, we always call her W.E.B. Du Bois' wife. When we talk about Amy Jacques Garvey, we always say Marcus Garvey's wife, right? when we talk about the first Amy Garvey, we say that she's the first wife of Marcus Garvey. When we talk about many Pan-African leaders, they're always connected to men, right? And so the question becomes, how come we have allowed patriarchy to ultimately find its way into the Pan-African movement? Patriarchy is institutionalized in a way that history is written. So, for example, if history is written by men, or if history is written in a patriarchal society, women will be written out of that history. And since we're talking about Shirley Graham Du Bois, and I have about 5 minutes, and I really don't want to talk the whole time about this PowerPoint. I want us to have a great conversation. I thought we would just highlight Shirley Graham Du Bois. So here she is here on my right, but could possibly be on your left. I'm not sure. She did a couple things. She challenged the social construction of gender. She wrote this play called Tom Tom, which is an epic. It's an epic of music, and basically it talks about the transatlantic slave trade. There's some errors there in the PowerPoint, so please ignore me. And basically, she follows these four individuals and their journey through the transatlantic slave trade. So ultimately, right in 1932, she's challenging the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism and slavery, right? In a time period where writing operas was very much male dominated and very Eurocentric. And this African woman is saying we need to stop and have a conversation in an opera about the transatlantic slave trade. Interestingly, she delivered W.E.B. Du Bois's address at the All African People's Conference in 1958. She created this black leftist magazine called Freedom Ways. It was published by Black and African communists. Unfortunately, it was funded by white communists, but that's just another conversation. She wrote biographies on Du Bois, on Douglass, on Booker T. Washington, and on Julius Nyerere. She wrote about 12 of them in total. And an interesting fact is that she moved to Ghana in 1961. She was the first director of our Ghana Broadcasting Corporation. And with Shirley Graham Du Bois, she moved to Egypt after the 1966 coup. She was arrested in Ghana. Everybody who was down with Nkrumah during that time period, or the CPP after the coup, was arrested. She was arrested. And now let's remember, she denounced her U.S. citizenship. And her brother had to come from the U.S. to get her out of jail. So this is one of the women that we say we should be highlighting her contributions to the Pan-African struggle. Instead, when we hear her name, we say she's the wife of W.E.B. Du Bois. And since I'm in Ghana, I just wanted to highlight a couple of women's organizations in Ghana. So, for example, there was the Conference of Women of Africa and African Descent in 1960. I believe it was in July. And about 150 women came together to talk about the challenges that African women face of African descent and those in the African diaspora. There was the West African Council of Women. And then there was the Afro-American Ghanaian Women's Friendship League, and Hannah Kojo was the secretary of this Afro-American Ghanaian Women's Friendship League. Now, this tells you that in the 1960s, there were women from the U.S. that weren't necessarily Shirley Graham Du Bois in Ghana, making some contributions to Pan-Africanism. Why don't we hear about them? What are the challenges and how do we move beyond this? And so, since we're talking about Pan-Africanism today, I thought we would talk about, just very briefly, how some of the current manifestations of Pan-Africanism are led by women. So, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement, we know that three of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement are women, one out of Nigeria. We have a Black Hairstyle Collective out of Colombia, where you have Black women who are coming together and they're talking about African-centered things through Black hairstyles, right? And this Black Hairstyle Collective is promoting natural hair, but it's more than that. It's promoting that African people in Colombia are also of African descent. And then we have the Landless Peoples Movement in South Africa, right? And this is about talking about, along with the Fallist movements in South Africa, and many women are at the forefront, many women and trans folks are at the forefront of these movements, specifically the Fallist movements. You have, whether it's Rhodes Must Fall or Fees Must Fall, you have women and trans folks in the forefront of these movements for fees to fall, for there to be support, social support for contract workers, really an extension of the anti-apartheid movement and the Black consciousness movement. And then lastly, there's the landless workers movement in Brazil. And this movement, although it talks about landless workers, and there's also indigenous Brazilian folks who are indigenous to that area, We know that the majority of people in Brazil have African descent or of African descent. This is the one nation behind Nigeria that has the most people of African descent in it. So the question we can ask ourselves is, why is it that when we have women both historically and present in these movements and leading the movements and losing their lives, like the senator, the elected official in Brazil who was killed indiscriminately in Bahia, shot down by a former police, and yet and still we're still saying, where are women in the Pan-African movement? So the question becomes, where do we go from here? Let's discuss how we change the narrative about women and Pan-Africanism in the 21st century. So I think that's all of the discussion I wanted to have. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, which I just did.
Okay.
And I want to come back and answer any questions that anyone will have after you speak, because I would love to hear more about your book, because I believe your fiction. First of all, tell us a little bit about how you think fiction impacts Pan-Africanism, because your book is about the Fifth Pan-African Congress, if I'm not mistaken.
It is.
And I'm hoping that you can tell us how, we can use fiction to promote Pan-Africanism. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you for that presentation. I found it really interesting. And you told me a lot of things that I didn't actually know. Because the thing is that when you are doing research on something, you're very narrow in what you're researching. So, yeah, I came at my novel and Pan-Africanism through looking at communism. My father was in the UK in 1950 from Nigeria, and he said that the communists sent him to Manchester. So that was where my research started, and I thought I was going to write about Africa, communism, and the connections with Manchester, until I went to the, I think it was the Labour History Museum, and they had this whole presentation on the Fifth Pan-African Congress that took place in Manchester, actually not far from Manchester Metropolitan University, and they did have a very, very small plaque on the wall that's now gone because they've taken down the building. And yeah, I started researching. I started looking at some photographs, and I saw all of these leaders, like all the people that were at the Pan-African Congress. So you had Kenyatta, you had Padmore, you had Dubai, you had all of these people that were there, and there were no women in these photographs. There were no African women in these photographs. So then I started going through lectures, and there were definitely African women who were running kind of, I don't know, it was connected to the Communist Party, but it wasn't quite connected to the Communist Party, but there were women's liberation committees that were being run. And so I decided that my novel, having not come from a background of understanding everything about the All African Party, I wasn't brought up with any knowledge of Africa, even though my father was African. So I decided that it was going to be women, and an African woman in particular, who was going to feature in this novel. And then I decided that it would start in 1945 because I wanted her at that conference. And then from there, I did some research in the Nigerian embassy, actually in London, and they have a big archive in the back. And I said I was looking for some connection between Pan-Africanism and Nigeria round about 1945. And there was a professor there from Nigeria, and he said, oh, no, you need to start in 1929, because the precursor to all nations that got their independence actually started in 1929 with the ABBA women's riots. And there were these two young workers there, and they started laughing, and they said, oh, that's when all the women were running around naked. And he turned around and looked at them. He said, oh, no. He said, that's when the women stood up against the colonial masters who were in Nigeria and who wanted to tax them on the goods that they were selling in the market. And they stood and they refused, and they peacefully stood. And it was really interesting to me how that such an important history involving women, because the men were already being taxed by the colonial government, by the British government, but it's when they came for the women who were actually sustaining the families, that's when the women said, no, enough. And this was changed. This was changed to women running around naked and not doing anything serious. And that annoyed me, obviously. So my whole novel really is, I am going to say it's Pan-African, looking at what Pan-Africanism is, because it's looking at a unity of women, but it's not looking at women as angels. It's called A House with No Angels. And I kind of took that from a writer has to kill the angel in the house. A woman has to kill the angel in the house in order to write. But none of my characters are angels, and I didn't want them to be angels. This picture that's up is the print copy of my novel, and there's also a Kindle copy. That's the Kindle copy, just so you don't get confused when you want to go and buy it. But none of my characters are perfect, because they are human beings and they are women. I wanted to start with Africa, so my oldest character came over from Nigeria to Manchester and took part in the Pan-African Congress. And she comes out of colonial time, she comes out of colonial beings. So her opinions and the things that she looks at are going to be very, very different. And then I have my next character who is born and bred in Manchester, but she has this juxtaposition of having an African mother and having a British father, but these parents live in each other's countries and they don't live together. And I wanted to kind of portray a confusion, because we had the 1945 Pan-African Congress. People were fired up. They knew what they wanted. And independence was gained by an awful lot of countries. But then you go through a period of, we had the civil rights movement, obviously, we had the Black Power movement, and that is being held down because the powers that be are saying, listen, you got your independence, leave us now, let us still be in charge, let us still be in control. And I wanted that character to kind of play with that whole period of confusion, of not knowing what's what, and of wanting to fight, but of withdrawing and of being held down, because I feel that as soon as things are legislated, they lose power, and that's sometimes what happens. So I'm expecting now with the Black Lives Movement, they will start to legislate certain things, because this uprising now is an uprising and it is big and it's not going away. It cannot go away. And so legislation is going to come in, and it will just pierce a little bit and let a little bit of the fire come out, because, well, we've legislated. Just like equality is legislated, but we know that within the workplace, equality does not exist. So kind of around with that with my middle character. And then with Mungi's character, I had her as being British. She's Black and she's British. And not feeling a need to explore anything outside of that until something happens within her friend circle. And at that point, and the fact that she has to go back to Nigeria, and she does say, yeah, I'm not African, but having to go back to Nigeria with the family, she then finds her roots. And I think my whole novel is about the identity and about how identity changes over the generations as people move into the diaspora. And so I think that Pan-Africanism is really important in knowing that it's about Africa and it's about the diaspora and it's about bringing all peoples together. Okay.
Excellent. So I'm sorry, I was writing some notes while you were speaking. You know, one of the things that I thought was particularly powerful about your book was your opening sort of paragraph or statement, or your opening scene where a young woman is on her way to be whisked away by Peter. It's Peter, right? A
Yes.
young Nigerian woman has been impregnated by a 25-year-old European that has been stationed in Nigeria, and she's being whisked away. And I'm just wondering, while you were speaking, and I encourage people to read the book because there's a lot of the symbolism in the book, but I'm just thinking like that specific scene of this young woman being, I mean, in 2020, a 25-year-old engaging with an underage child is not a consensual relationship, right? I'm just saying. I don't know what was going on in Nigeria during that time period. But the young woman gets married, right? And he goes to these nuns who are going to help her with aborting the child or giving the child something of this nature. And then they decide to whisk her off to England, and there's just this symbol. So can you talk a little bit about the symbolism of this opening scene, right? Of how this plays into Pan-Africanism.
Okay, so this Ade, we're talking about Ade now, and Ade is the character who has fallen in love with Peter. He's called Peter in one book, he's called James in the other. I played around with his name. That's what I did. So she had the power. And I did that purposefully. Yes, she was 16 or she was 15 when she started seeing him or started falling in love with him. But he didn't touch her until after she was 16, which is the age of consent. And I very purposefully did it in such a way, and as you get to the end of the book, you understand a little bit more that she was not being manipulated as much as she was manipulating. And yes, she's a child. At 16, you're a child. There's no two ways of looking at that. But it was an age of consent, so she made the choice. She forced him. And in a way, my symbolism was that, yes, Britain was in Africa, it was in Nigeria, and it felt that it was in control, and it felt that it was doing what it wanted to do. And yes, it did. And there's no denying that Europe decimated Africa, from putting in its borders, from doing everything that it's ever done, and it's still doing now, it's still taking. But the symbolism for Ade and Peter was that she was going to stand strong. She was going to get what she wanted out of this. And also the fact that he was there, so she was there. And very much like Pan-Africanism it was kind of run for people in the diaspora. And so she had to be a part of that. And that was part of the symbolism that yes, she is a Pan-African symbol for what was going on in 1945. But it had to be from a woman's perspective because women were being written out. As always, they were written out of history. I didn't know about, was it Sonia Dubois? Mm-hmm. I didn't know about her at all because she had never been talked about in the books that I've read, in the research that I did. So I had to have Ade as a very vocal, very strong young woman to get what she wanted.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that I think that you make this very interesting point about this young woman sort of dictating the relationship, and suggesting that African countries and just African people have more agency than are often either thought or the agency is there, but the history is told as if there was no agency, right?
Yes.
And I think that that's an excellent point, because I think when I'm thinking about the current Black Lives Matter movements and this question about agency and where the agency comes from, we also have to remind ourselves of this current iteration of Black Lives Matter, whether it's the Flawless movement, the Black Lives Matter movement now, the Black Lives Matter movement 5 years ago, or any of the movements in between, they've all sort of they didn't just spring up out of nowhere, right? They're part of this larger sort
Exactly.
of trajectory of Pan-African activity, which includes, for example, the contributions of Nanny of the Maroons. I mean, like, if you can think about a woman, for example, who fights with the colonizers, takes a group of people in to the mountains and builds a community there, and no one can like penetrate the community. I mean, like, there's something beyond comprehension about a woman like that's power, right? And so when we're even thinking about how we evaluate women and women's contributions inside of these movements or inside of these organizations, we have to look at it from a very dialectical perspective. Certainly women have agency, but then women also are negatively impacted by patriarchy. And like, if you think
Absolutely.
about it, you know, like, if you think about women making all of these contributions, even being smashed down by patriarchy, even having a triple oppression, you know, race, class, and gender oppression. The contributions that women have made, even being triply oppressed, can you imagine the types of contributions we could make if we absolutely took patriarchy straight on and eradicated it from the Pan-African movement?
Yes, that would be something very, very powerful. I mean, thinking about the Pan-African movement as well, I posed all of those questions in the slide recording at the beginning. So who is included in the Pan-African movement? Sexual orientation, where does that stand within the Pan-African movement?
Mm-hmm.
There are so many, I don't like isms. I always have a problem with isms. Once something becomes an ism, it kind of gets shaped into this exclusive thing, and you have to be a part of it, and you have to maybe dress in a certain way, talk in a certain way, think in a certain way. And I find that the Black Lives Matter movement and Pan-Africanism in its purest form does away with that, because it has, I think one of your first slides said that it's not shaped in one shape. It has very many different ways of being. And I think that that's really important to acknowledge. We're talking a lot. People, if you have questions, please send us some comments, send us some questions, and we'll be happy to answer those and to talk to them.
Yeah, I think I want to answer one of your questions briefly. Hopefully, if other people can bring their questions. Otherwise, I'll yield if we have a question. Do we have any questions? I think we have one question.
The 5th Pan-African Congress happened in Manchester. What resources, archival, academic, and literary, are available to find out more about the role of women at this conference?
Wow. I mean, what kind of question is that?
The role of women. Now that's really interesting. We have, very fortunately, a book by Hakeem Addy and Marika Sherwood, and that's the 1945 Manchester Pan-African Congress Revisited. That's a really important book. It has all the scripts from everybody there, and obviously there were a couple of women there, and their scripts are in here. And I did my research and I literally didn't come up with very much at all, which is why I wrote my novel, because I wanted women to be featured. It's really interesting. That is an interesting question. I don't know. Have you got anything on that, Mjiba?
Well, you know, interestingly enough, I was literally just looking at this, and I think that there's some scholars who have written on this. Of course, Professor Horace Campbell has written on this. You mentioned Hakeem Addy. There's a Bonita Harris that wrote a text on women in Pan-Africanism. There's a feminist. There's a journal called Feminist Africa, and there's that actually a article in their 2019 or 19 publication called The First Mrs. Garvey, Pan-Africanism and Feminism in the Early 20th Century British Colonial Caribbean. So
Okay.
there are some stuff. There is some stuff out there. There's a lot of stuff on Shirley Graham Du Bois, Marcus, Amy Jacques Garvey, and so I think that the problem that we have is that the amount of material on the men is like here, and the amount of material on the women is like here, so you can barely see it, right?
But that talks into the whole history of women being written out of things.
Exactly.
So.
And like, for example, if you think about like, I'm just thinking about the history of like the Black Panther Party, for example, and even the CPP, like in Ghana, you had market women that were like one of the major reasons why Nkrumah won the election, and all of a sudden, you can't even see one of the market women's face. I mean, like there's, we hear about Hannah Kojo and other people, but if you say market women Ama, like you can't even picture any of the market women's faces or the market women's organization from Makola Market, right? Because we don't know who they are. So I think it's a challenge to us to really begin to write the stories of women who were instrumental in the Pan-African movement, as well as women who are doing the work today. Because that's the other thing, is that we tend to forget to write story. We tend to forget that we also are making history today, or herstory, as some people say.
History, yes, absolutely. We did have another question that actually flashed up, which was, what was the global significance of the Pan-African Conference in Manchester? It was independence. It was the precursor to independence. It was the starting of something that couldn't be stopped. And the people were there. I mean, Nkrumah was there. In my novel, I have Nkrumah, and what I wanted to do, because women had been written out so completely, I actually wanted to humanize these men who were at the conference, who were a part of something big. But I read, I think it was in Awolowo's biography, and he said that Nkrumah could dance. I had Nkrumah in my novel, and I had him dancing because I wanted to humanize. I wanted to bring him to the level that the women are seen as, and that doesn't take away anything that he then went on to do. I had another story. One of my friends, his mum was around Manchester at the time of the Congress, and she saw Jomo Kenyatta striding down the street in his hat. He always had his hat on. And I love those little stories because it brings them into being human beings. They were people who had other people behind them, and quite often they had women behind them. And that's all part of the importance of it. But what happened, like the fifth Pan-African Congress in 1945 pushed independence around the world. That's what it did.
Yeah, definitely. And you know what? This Congress in 1945 had the most Pan-African representation of all of the congresses or conferences. And I think this is particularly important, right? Because if we look at 1900 and we look at this conference that W.E.B. Du Bois was pushing, it was very because now let's be honest, like we have to be ahistorical, right? Like in 1900, the entire African continent was under colonialism, right?
Yes.
So sometimes we're like confused about what was happening historically during the time period. And we then begin to criticize those that did work during that period without having a critical analysis. So, but during that time period, this 1900 conference was dominated by Caribbean-born Africans and Africans born in the US. And so their direction or their analysis of the way forward included the eradication of colonialism and racism. But what they did, they were like asking for like the colonialists to like, allow African people to like have rights as humans. They weren't saying like colonialism out. They weren't saying independence now, but also it was because of the time period, right?
Yes.
And so And so you have to remind yourself of that. And I have to also remind myself of that sometimes as well, you know? And then if you're looking at the progression of the, you know, the first, the second, the third, the fourth, and then let's go to the fifth, you see that they are radically saying, down with colonialism, down with racism. Africa needs independence now. And it
Yes.
really pushed, as you mentioned, it really pushed independence. Because if you think about 45, you know, Nkrumah is at this conference and he's the general secretary, right? And then 47, he's on his way back home, right? And 48, 47, 48, he starts working for the UGCC. And during that time period, him and other, you know, Pan-African leaders are pushing independence now on the continent. And so the question becomes, and not only that, let me also say this, that if we also look at the Bandung conference, right, this non-aligned movement, the 45 conference really helped to, really was connected to this Bandung conference, right? And even if and I'm zigzagging a bit, but I also just want to remind ourselves that after Nkrumah left the 45 conference, he went home and then Ghana gained independence in 57. 1958, they started having the All African Peoples Conference, the women and of African descent and diaspora conference, which I just said the name and I can't seem to remember it. They had a All African Trade Union Conference, All African Educators Conference, a conference of freed African states. So now all of a sudden, Ghana becomes the epicenter for Pan-Africanism. Ghana is literally training liberation fighters in Ghana at the Kwame Nkrumah Ideological Institute on both arms training, ideological training to say, let's go back home, liberate your spaces, and let's build a unified, you know, Africa. And so this conference really, really was the watershed moment for Ghana, for Africa's independence. So that's what I would suggest. It looks like we have lost our colleague, but she will be right back. Our technical support, do we have any other questions? Let's see if we have any questions. Aha, here we go. Were there any speeches about African women's liberation at the conference? This is an excellent question, and I do not have the answer for that, but I will certainly look for that, right? Because I think that this is important to ask ourselves, you know, were women on the forefront? You know, were women in the forefront of this conference, although there were women there? And what I noticed around this time period is that women tended to be in the forefront of liberation and Pan-Africanism, and the issues of women tended to be a secondary issue, right? And not because it wasn't as valid, but what I noticed is that African women, Pan-Africanist women during this time period, what they wanted to do was they realized that Africa must be liberated. And once Africa is liberated, they would then address the liberation of African women. But I think it's important to dissect all of the speeches at this conference to then find out, you know, were there any specific speeches about African women? So thank you very much for that conference. And I'm writing that down so that when I do my research, I can find that. Do we have any more questions? What effect did the Pan-African movement have on writers and what is its living legacy? Wow, this is an amazing question. And I wish my co-presenter was here because she's definitely a writer. Let's see, do we have any more questions? And then we can come back to this one. What effect? I'm writing this down. Aha. Okay, so let's try this one. What effect did the Pan-African movement have on writers and what is its living legacy? Well, so when I think about writers, I also think about writers from different perspectives, right? So I think about fiction writers, which Muli is a fiction writer, or her book is fiction. I think about nonfiction writers. I think about academics. I think about people who write poetry. I think about the people like Richard Wright. And so I think that when we look at Pan-African writers or just writers in general, I think what the Pan-African movement did is it made it okay and possible to challenge colonialism and racism, right? So if I'm thinking back to W.E.B. Du Bois, right, and many of W.E.B. Du Bois's writings, where he talks about this question of the double consciousness, or he talks about the question of the 20th century being the question of the color line, or Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, right? All of these books are written in or around the Pan-African Congresses, right? Because we're talking 1900 to 1945. And so all of these writers, Richard Wright, James Baldwin, Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, Shirley Graham Du Bois, even when we're looking at the works of, for example, the UNIA and the UNIA newspaper, we see that Pan-Africanism really pushed writers to challenge colonialism and racism, and really began to say, how do African people promote their own agency within a space that's equitable and just, right? And even when I think about writing on a local and global scale, I'm thinking back to Kwame Nkrumah and the CPP. During that time period, they had many newspapers in Ghana, but one of them was the Accra Evening News and the Daily Graphic. And from 57 to about 66, there were articles every single day about Pan-Africanism, about nationalism, about socialism, and ultimately everything in between. And so, for example, when Patrice Lumumba was killed in the Congo, there were multiple articles about Patrice Lumumba's unjust killing, right? There were articles in the paper, and these are editorials, and these are newspaper articles by everyday people, right? You don't have to have a PhD to write about Pan-Africanism. There were people who were sending poems to the newspaper. There were people who had illustrations about Africa releasing her chains from colonialism. And so when we think about the impact of Pan-Africanism on writers, and really the writers of history, I would suggest that it ultimately gave writers the go ahead, right? The go ahead to challenge colonialism, to challenge racism. And you had many underground papers. I believe Nnamdi Azikiwe out of Nigeria, since we were talking about Nigeria, he had many papers that were challenging Pan-Africanism, so much so that he got deported, I believe, out of Liberia for the Pan-African political content in his newspaper. Welcome back, and we have an excellent question that I've been trying to answer from my own perspective, but I think you probably have more information.
Okay. Can I apologize? I actually, the electricity just shorted out because I'm on a desktop and it's taken this long for everything to come back on. So I do apologize. We practiced for this, didn't we? I never thought it would happen to me.
We did, and I didn't think it would happen, but it did.
Okay, there we go. We're live. Okay, so what effect did the Pan-African movement have on writers, and what is its living legacy? I was actually looking up directly before we had this discussion for Pan-African women fiction, and nothing comes together. So maybe that's a paper we need to be writing, but nothing actually comes together. I found something from the Caribbean on Dion Brand's poetry. And so then I start asking myself, so what is Pan-African fiction? And if Pan-Africanism is about unity, and if Pan-Africanism is in support of people in the African diaspora or in Africa itself, I find that most of the literature, most of the fiction, most of the poetry, most of the plays that are coming out of people in the diaspora or in Africa itself, those can be termed Pan-African, especially when they don't cater to the stereotypes of those that are put in place for what is acceptable as Black literature.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you know what? You said something, and it just I was like, oh my gosh, this makes so much sense. And this is not literature, but this could be literature. I'm thinking about Nina Simone's Let's Start a Revolution, or her song Revolution, and if people have not heard Nina Simone's song Revolution, go to YouTube and find that song, because it is absolutely Pan-African in form. And Nina Simone, as an artist, exemplified Pan-Africanism. I mean, she ultimately tanked her artistic career because she was pushing for the liberation of African people in the US. And she went around, the country, around the world, pushing this, right? And so I think, and she even spent like 5 or 10 years living in Liberia, right? So look up Nina Simone. I see we have another question.
Okay, is the Black Lives Matter movement an opportunity to rediscover Pan-African writers and address the movement's past shortcomings? Yeah, I find so. I think it's still being dominated by men, even though it was started with women. And I have noticed a lot of the top 10 books to read for the Black Lives Matter movement or for Pan-Africanism, they're coming through now. So yes, it is about rediscovering, or for us highlighting what's out there. I think that there is a place for many more fiction writers to be highlighted, because what I found is that when I go to these lists thinking I'm going to find some great new fiction writers here, I'm finding a lot of theory books, which is good. We need that. But for me, fiction reaches the masses. So write a good story and people are going to read it and they get transported into the lives of those characters. And I think that's what's important. Yeah, we're rediscovering, we're finding new things, we're finding old things. And I think that, yes, it does have to address, and it does address in some ways, what's gone before. But then I don't feel that we can just say that what went before was wrong. What went before went before. And it's a platform. And Maya Angelou says, when you know better, do better. And that's all we can do from now.
Yeah, and I think that there's an excellent question that I think that we should address too, from Alicia Pierce. But I want to also say something that I think is oftentimes discussed, but not necessarily like highlighted. Like, the interesting thing about women in the Pan-African movement is that during the movement, oftentimes we're not sidelined. We are in the forefront. We are doing the grunt work. We are writing speeches. We are sidelined when men are getting the glory. I'm sorry to say it. We're sidelined in history. We are on the front lines. We are getting arrested. We are getting beat. We are getting killed, right? But we are on the sidelines when history comes. And I think this is really what's really important. And we also find ourselves in the sidelines inside organizations, but we also do the mass amount of work. Actually, we find ourselves on the sidelines fighting for space at the table. So other women are a little bit reluctant to come into the organizations. So here are the spaces that we need to address. A technical person, can you please bring that question back up? Okay, within Pan-Africanism, what are the implications of misogyny on women in writing? Is it misogyny or misogynoir? Misogynoir, I'm sorry, excuse me.
Whew. Thanks, Aaliyah. Okay. It's there. Actually, this really fits in with something else that I wanted to mention, which was, there's a film by Horace Ove called Pressure that was out in, I can't quite remember when it was. I think it was the 70s. And the film was shown in Manchester and Horace Ove was there. He came to the viewing. It had been arranged by Black Arts Alliance. And we watched the movie, and it was about the Black Power movement. It was a really stirring, it was a really moving movie, and I would suggest that people go and watch it. It's called Pressure. But what happened was, there was a woman who was there along with all of the guys, and she was on the platform and she was fighting and she was giving her speeches along with all of the men. In fact, we saw quite a lot more of her. And then when the police came, she was the one that was caught and she was the one that was beaten. And that was okay. It's not okay, but that was okay in the context of the movie. But then the 15-year-old boy in the movie had this sexual fantasy about her where she was tied to a bed, and it was like a dream, and it was shown in like fully. And that bothered me. And that was the one question that I asked Horace over at the end, because I was vexed. And it's like, no matter what this woman was doing, no matter what she was standing for, she could be reduced by a male child into a sexual object. So that fits in very nicely with what Alia is asking. And what are the implications? Because it's there. It's there because of toxic masculinity. It's there because of societal norms of what is expected of the woman. It's there within what women are expected to write about, so what they're expected to be grateful about within their writing. So Pan-Africanism has some work to do.
Yeah.
And I don't want there to be a separatist movement of a women's Pan-African movement and a man's Pan-African movement, because I feel that we have to stand together. It's about unity. Pan-Africanism is about unity.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I think, Aaliyah, I think that this is like an excellent question, right? And I think it's an excellent question because there are multiple implications, right? Like the reality is, if we don't address this question of patriarchy inside the Pan-African movement, the Pan-African movement is going to be consistent of men. And I don't mean any harm, but women make up over 51% of the African population. So how can 49% of the population think that they are going to organize and defeat our enemy? It's just not possible, right? We're talking about systems. So ultimately, we have to address patriarchy inside of Pan-Africanism, the Pan-African movement, Pan-African organizations, Pan-African families. For example, you can't be the biggest Pan-Africanist in the Pan-African movement and be beaten up on women. That's a serious contradiction. You know, you can't be in a Pan-African movement and talk down to women or believe that women, their primary role is sex objects. And we also have to recognize a couple of other things. Women also, patriarchy is about ideology too, right? So it's not just like men wake up and they're like, you know, I just want to start oppressing women. That's not it. It's ingrained in the capitalist system.
Systemic.
Which means women also are impacted by patriarchy, which means women also participate in patriarchal behavior. And sometimes we don't want to hear that, but it's true. So we have to attack patriarchy ideologically. We have to attack patriarchy inside the Pan-African movement and outside the Pan-African movement from an ideological perspective, because we have to attack the system. And I think for me, this is where Pan-Africanism must go in the next 10 years. We must address the internal contradictions of the Pan-African movement. And then once we do that, we will have no problems moving forward. That's my conclusion.
Great. And I would also like to say that with women and writing and Pan-Africanism, we need our gatekeepers, who may be the Black men, to actually acknowledge that what we write is just as important. It's just as important, and we have just as much to say. And that is something that cannot be overlooked within Pan-Africanism. Women and writing. Women are holders of the traditions. Women are the keepers of family, of stories, of what's happening. We always have that older ancestor, and I had that in my novel, this ancestor that just kept appearing and nobody questioned, because she's just there with her strength. So it's, yeah, and that feeds into the patriarchy that's within Pan-Africanism. And I think that our men have got to step up.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think we're getting to the end now. I again apologize for me disappearing for that 7-8 minutes. That's how long it took my electricity to come back. But thank you for holding the fort, Mjiba.
I'll try. I want to thank you also, and also everybody who sent in questions, and everybody who
Yes.
joined this exciting panel presentation. Or it's a discussion, a conversation, right? It's not a panel presentation. It's just a discussion.
No, it's just a discussion. Did you actually? There was a question there about speeches about African women's liberation at the conference. Did you cover that?
I did
Good.
cover that, and I said
Good.
I have no idea, and I need to do some research to find out. So hopefully.
Oh yeah, well yeah, there was plenty of talk about that from Amy Garvey. She talked about Jamaica, and that I can't remember the other woman's name again.
Excellent.
History, yeah.
Excellent.
So it was there. It was talked about.
Excellent. Thank you so much. You see, that is why we're here having a wonderful conversation.
Yes. Okay.
So, I hear we're not gonna. There may be some questions that we weren't able to answer, but perhaps we can do that in our next session, which I hear may or may not happen sometime in the future.
Yes.
We shall see. But hopefully we can, if not answer questions, maybe people can reach out to us. I guess I can put my email out. I should have put it on the page, but if anyone wants to reach me via email, they can reach me at mafrehiwot@gmail.com.
Okay. And also you can reach us through the Pandemicus page. You can send any questions, any comments on there, and we'll be able to pick those up. And I'd just like to say thank you to everybody for joining us. I really enjoyed that. I was very nervous. I didn't think it was going to be that, but I really enjoyed it. So thank you, Mjiba, and thank you, everybody. And thank you, technical support.
Yes, thank you, technical support.